Civ 7 has had a blitzkrieg of a release cycle, with new leader reveals, dev diaries, and live streams to kick things off before launching in 2025. But something else has been sprinkled into the mix, a heaping tablespoon of controversy. Controversial decision making is nothing new to Firaxis, but amidst all of the chaos and torment of the internet, I wanted to talk about the spicier design choices the developers have made for Civ 7, and dig deeper into some of the core complaints people are airing. To start, one of the biggest departures the franchise has taken is with the new leader mechanics. In prior games, you chose a static leader and nation to stick with until the game over screen. Now, it's possible for players to pick their own leaders and match them with whatever nation they choose. For example, if I wanted to play Pachacudi with Germany, I could very much do so and build the finest terrace farms this world has ever seen. However, a lot of the outrage I wanted to talk about is more so directed towards the leader picks themselves. Due to the nature of swapping, leader abilities tend to be generic because they need to synergize with a variety of cultures. Most of the flavor, if you will, instead shifts to the cultures. I don't have any grievances with this change, and I think it adds more replayability to the game, but on the other hand, I can also see why some people are disappointed. In fact, to play devil's advocate, the new skill trees that have been added look like a great addition for replay value. Likewise, in Civ 6, leaders were more constrained, but their abilities were impactful as a result. Pachacudi's last incarnation gave him an improvement that allowed units to take advantage of their hilly starts. It's possible that we could get more leaders with unique features, but I am not optimistic. The other angle that has some fans riled up is the leader picks. We've had a few choices like Gandhi that have not been direct leaders of their respective countries in the past, but dear lord did my timeline blow up when Firaxis announced Harriet Tubman as a leader. There's been some complaints here and there about philosophers like Confucius representing China, but opinions can change depending on who you talk to. The audience for Civ is heavily American, so this announcement may have gone better if the other choice was a president. Instead, we've received Benjamin Franklin, who is an interesting pick, but never led the country. For my comment historians, there was a similar situation in the past with Civ 2 where the wife of a president was a potential leader, but Abraham Lincoln was an alternative choice in that game, so I think that kind of cancels things out. Tubman didn't have any political power either, obviously, but if the criteria was to have a notable black leader for the United States, I think they could have picked a more recent candidate that had wide-reaching effects on legislation, like Martin Luther King Jr. None of this is to diminish Tubman's role in the Underground Railroad, of course, but perhaps it would have been more fitting to give her a spot as a great leader instead. There's been so many articles from the media covering this specific leader, and spending the rest of the video talking about it would be a waste. Nevertheless, the conspiracy theorist in me feels like they knew in advance that she wouldn't be a perfect fit for a leader, and this choice was solely to get people talking about the game. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. There are also a lot of things I think the game does right, from what I've seen so far. In particular, I really like the exploration age and how the map expands as you navigate the oceans. I reached this point in 4X games where the early and late game can be exciting for different reasons, but the mid game feels like a slog where I wait until things pick up. By reducing map sizes and saving them for later, the developers can add more features that expand on exploration. Firaxis was getting a colossal amount of slack for reducing player numbers and map sizes with 7, but this won't affect me as negatively, so there is some bias here. Something to consider is that this adds more relevancy to naval gameplay. Civ 6 and practically all the other entries that I can think of lack naval development to some degree. When every map has some equivalent of a new world, navies suddenly become much more important to your empire. I made a video several months ago covering a similar topic, and a lot of the comments said things about how they skip Civ 6 or how they think the game is taking the wrong direction, and others that flat out say the game is quote-unquote too woke. But I'm not going to do an hour-long takedown micro-analyzing each second of game footage to destroy Firaxis with facts and logic. My take is that, unlike Civ 6, a lot of the heat is on the core gameplay mechanics, and not the art style itself. How the one thing that I've seen praised consistently is the game's visuals, apart from the UI, and I find the terrain very pleasing to look at, personally speaking. Rather, I take issue with how aggressively monetized this game seems to be compared to its predecessor. Yes, Civ 6 did have one of the longest paid content runs in franchise history, but the developers seem to already be pushing paid content. I'm okay with the pre-order bonuses since the last game had them with the Aztecs, who were released to the general public later, but this is taking it to a whole new level. If it's not enough that the game is $70, you have to pay $30 more for the Deluxe Edition, which has its own DLC behind it. On top of this, there is even more DLC in the form of the Founders Edition for $130. Paying all of that gives you 4 new leaders, 8 new cultures, and 8 new wonders. If you go back to Civ 6, you may recall that it also had a separate leader pass, but I don't recall them asking such an astronomical price for it. I mean, the level of sheer greed to ask upwards of $60 for additional content before the game even releases is madness to me. I'm certain a lot of the planned DLC we see in these editions can be purchased separately in the future, but I had hoped that Civ would hold out a little more longer against these shitty practices that the gaming industry has pioneered thus far. Since we're still on the topic, the implementation of cultures has been an anger point in a lot of the comments I've come across. Culture swapping has been well known for a while, but what perplexes me is how stubborn Firaxis has been about giving players more agency. In a franchise that has been all about player freedom and forging your own destiny in a historical sandbox, one of the biggest no-brainers would be to allow players to stick with their initial culture, instead of being forced to change with each new era. Yet, each article I come across on this topic has the developers adamantly refusing to implement such an obvious feature that has been the cornerstone of the franchise. Pacing has always been finicky in Civilization. When all of history is condensed into 3 separate ages though, you get awkward jumps like the Normans to the Americans. Now, the medieval and Renaissance or early modern eras have to share space with one another. We are getting one of the largest culture rosters yet, but it feels that much smaller because the starting list is confined to a third of what it would normally be without culture swapping. Even Humankind, which many Civ fans in the past have torn to shreds, ironically, allowed you to retain a single culture throughout gameplay. Sure, this wasn't the most optimal strategy, but at least it was there as an option. It's just so surreal to see a resistance to feedback when the developers talk about having the best fans in gaming, have an active presence on forums, and interact with commenters live. In the last live stream, for example, the developers revealed that the modern age would start in the 1700s and end at rocketry. I've seen people complaining about the end date, but Civ 6 similarly ended before our current time period, and it doesn't bother me that much. Instead, I'm concerned with the gameplay balance and future content. During this stream, the devs seemed to hint that there may be an expansion adding one more age to the game, like with what Gathering Storm did with the Future Era, and I think this circles back to Firaxis' priorities. It's too early to be talking about DLC when you haven't released the base game. This was true for Civ 6, and it's no different for Civ 7. It's baffling that we're even talking about this because the UI still hasn't been improved. In the exact same stream, you can see this play out through the menus. Almost all of the pop-up windows strictly adhere to this flat, gray tone. This really doesn't help when you put it next to the dark gray city tiles that dot the modern map. Back during Civ 7's first reveal, I can't recall how many times various playtesters were complaining about the UI feeling underdeveloped and half-baked, only to offer vague reassurance that it would change in the future. We have a few months to go, but it's quite jarring to see how little has been changed. I understand there is an approval process for assets, and it can take a while to get everything implemented, but if a studio is showing off promotional material for a game, is it unfair to expect a little more polish? I probably wouldn't be so critical if the city tiles were more colorful. I'm almost beginning to get Civ 4 flashbacks, in that the endgame map looks more like a parking lot than a world map. There's so many whites, grays, and earth tone colors that I ironically find myself pining for more of Civ 6's saturation, even as devilish as an admission that is. The first 2 ages for the game look spectacular, but I feel that none of the buildings blend together to form an actual city. I had this exact same problem with 6, because districts were spread too far apart and lacked detail, whereas with this iteration, the cities are far more condensed, but the sprawl itself lacks variety and feels that it overly relies on unique buildings. For a better example, Humankind handles city sprawl differently. It introduces a commons quarter that helps with adjacency bonuses and city planning. Although cities do become questionably large in the late game, they look more lived in. The modern age cities that I've seen for Civ 7 are almost alien to me, and scale is something that I want to briefly talk about. People have complained in the past about model sizes with Civ 6. Civ 5 had smaller units, but better emphasized quantity with their sheer numbers. Civ 7 instead replicates larger units, which makes sense when they disperse for the new combat system, but when you see the garrisoned units, it feels slightly off. I'm by no means a fan of Civ 5, but I understand where a lot of people are coming from when they criticize the newest game. At the same time, the developers have plainly stated that larger changes are necessary for newer iterations. But let me quote you directly from an interview earlier this month. In Civilization 7, the greatest overhaul is being made in the service of what Beach says is the #1 issue that the Civ games struggle with: players not finishing their games. We had a lot of data that people would play Civilization games and they would never get all of the way to the end, he says. They just wouldn't finish them, so we wanted to do whatever we could, whether it was reducing micromanagement, restructuring the game, to really address the problem directly. There are a lot of systemic refinements that we've gone through, and by and large, most of them thoughtfully look at where the player was investing their time and think about whether there's a better way to make that a little bit more streamlined. But this innovation can also be a double-edged sword. We've already talked about culture changing ad nauseum, but bringing back mechanics like happiness, which was fairly contentious in Civ 5, is going to elicit some groans. Other returning features, like disasters, are promising, but I guess we'll see how many changes were made to these returning systems when February comes around. I've been passively watching Civ 7 content for a few months ever since I posted my last video covering the newer features, but I'm waiting to see where we go from here. Let me know what you think of the pre-release information Firaxis has shown so far and what you're most excited for in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for watching and supporting the channel. Love you guys, and I hope to see you guys later. Alright, peace.